stop thinking, let things happen, and be the ball.
Caddyshack wasn't just a golf comedy, it was film chaos. The director had never touched a camera, the script was mostly blank, and a hurricane tore through production. And somewhere in the wreckage, an animatronic gopher became the hero no one planned for. These are 20 weird facts about Caddyshack you completely missed. Before Caddyshack was Caddyshack, it was something darker. Harold Ramis didn't walk into studios pitching golf jokes. He pitched a comedy about the American Nazi Party. Dark, biting, dangerous. The studios passed. Too risky, too ugly. So Ramis and his writing partner Doug Kenny regrouped and tried again. This time, the pitch was 3 words. Animal House on a golf course. That worked. The studio greenlit it immediately, but those 3 words weren't a script. They were a gamble. A concept with no story, no structure, just a vibe and a location. Ramis had written Ghostbusters, Animal House, and knew how to build comedy, but he'd never directed. He'd never called the shots, and now he was being handed millions of dollars to figure it out on the fly. The executives didn't know they were betting on chaos. They thought they were buying a formula. The weirdest idea won. The safest pitch hid the most chaotic production. Because Caddyshack wasn't born from confidence. It was born from rejection, desperation, and one last swing at something that might actually land. Harold Ramis had never directed a film, not a short, not a student project, nothing. And on day 1 of Caddyshack, it showed. He reportedly looked through the camera lens instead of the viewfinder, confused about what he was supposed to see. When the crew finished setting up the first shot, Ramis yelled, "Cut!" instead of "Action!" The assistant director had to gently correct him. Harold, we haven't started yet. The crew watched nervously. Some whispered. Others laughed it off. But Ramis didn't panic. He admitted he didn't know what he was doing and asked for help. The cinematographer walked him through the basics. The AD became his guide. And slowly, Ramis learned to direct by directing. Some crew members thought the production was doomed. Others respected his honesty and stuck around to see what would happen. It wasn't pretty, but it was honest. And somehow that honesty bled into the film itself. Loose, rough, unpolished, but real. Because Caddyshack didn't start with control. It started with chaos and a first-time director brave enough to admit he was lost. The gopher wasn't supposed to matter. Originally, it was one gag, a single joke about Carl Spackler hunting a rodent. The puppet cost thousands to build. Special effects legend John Dykstra, fresh off Star Wars, designed the animatronic creature. It had articulated joints, pneumatic controls, fur that cost more per inch than most actors made per day. It was high-tech, expensive, and meant to appear for maybe 30 seconds of screen time. Then Ramis watched the first cut. 4 hours long, unwatchable, no narrative through line, scenes that went nowhere. The studio panicked. Executives demanded reshoots, rewrites, anything to stitch the mess together. But Ramis had no time and no budget left, so they did something desperate. They went back to the gopher, shot more scenes, added reactions, built a subplot around the puppet. The crew thought it was insane, but it worked. The gopher became the spine of the film, the recurring visual thread that tied disconnected scenes into something resembling a story. What started as a background prop became the film's narrative anchor. A Star Wars engineer's expensive joke ended up saving a golf comedy, because sometimes the smallest character carries the biggest weight. Much of Caddyshack wasn't written. The screenplay had entire sections that just said, "Bill riffs here," or "Rodney improvises." No dialogue, no structure, just trust that the comedians would figure it out. And they did. Bill Murray improvised almost every line as Carl Spackler. The Dalai Lama speech, the Cinderella story, the flower-destroying monologue, none of it was scripted. Rodney Dangerfield showed up with a suitcase full of one-liners he'd written himself. He'd test them on the crew between takes. If they laughed, he kept it. If they didn't, he tossed it and tried another. Chevy Chase ad-libbed entire scenes. The crew stopped expecting anything to match the script. They just rolled cameras and hoped to catch lightning. Script supervisors gave up trying to track continuity. There was nothing to track. Ramis didn't fight it. He leaned in. He knew his script was weak, knew the real comedy would come from letting these legends loose. So he built a film around improvisation, around chaos, around the idea that comedy doesn't need a map, it just needs permission. Because Caddyshack wasn't directed, it was captured, and the best moments were the ones no one planned. Filming in South Florida seemed perfect. Warm weather, lush golf courses, ocean breezes. Then Hurricane David hit. September 1979, a Category 5 storm barreling straight toward the coast. Production shut down. The cast and crew hunkered in hotels, watched palm trees bend sideways, fairways, listen to wind scream past windows, flooding swamped streets, power cut out, no one knew when they'd shoot again. The production insurance barely covered the loss, and the studio started calculating whether to pull the plug entirely. When the storm passed, the golf course was wrecked, branches everywhere, greens flooded, sand traps turned to mud. The crew scrambled to clean up, repair what they could, but some of the damage stayed. You can see it in the film if you look close. Uneven grass, patchy fairways, skies that shift from clear to ominous between shots. But somehow the chaos fit. Caddyshack was already a disaster behind the scenes. The hurricane just made it literal, and when they finally resumed shooting, everyone felt like survivors. The film absorbed the storm. It became part of the texture because nature interrupted, but Caddyshack kept swinging. Rodney Dangerfield was a stand-up legend, but not a movie star. When he signed on for Caddyshack, his role as Al Chervik was small. A few scenes, a couple of jokes, background chaos. But the moment cameras rolled, everything changed. Dangerfield didn't just perform his lines, he attacked them. Every take was different, every joke landed harder. The crew loved him, Ramos loved him, so they kept writing more scenes, kept giving him space to riff. What started as a supporting role exploded into the film's comic engine. Dangerfield's improvised insults, his physical comedy, his timing, it all worked so well that the entire balance of the movie shifted. He brought his own wardrobe, his own props, even his own yacht for one scene. Suddenly Al Chervik wasn't just a side character, he was the chaos agent, the disruptor, the man who didn't belong but refused to leave. And Dangerfield played it perfectly. Brash, loud, unapologetic. He turned a bit into a breakout, because one comedian didn't just steal scenes, he rewrote the film's center of gravity. The scene where Al Chervik drills Judge Smales with a golf ball, that wasn't fiction. It happened to Harold Ramis in real life. Years earlier, Ramis was golfing when someone shanked a drive straight into his ribs. The impact knocked the wind out of him. He doubled over, gasping, humiliated. But he remembered the pain, the shock, the absurdity of it. So when writing Caddyshack, he put it in. Give the moment to Rodney Dangerfield. Let him weaponize a golf ball against Ted Knight's uptight judge. The scene plays as slapstick, but underneath it's real. Real physics, real pain, real memory. Knight reportedly needed ice packs after multiple takes, even though they used softer prop balls for most shots. Because comedy works best when it's grounded in truth. And sometimes the truth is just a golf ball to the ribs at 90 miles per hour. Bill Murray was only scheduled for 6 days of shooting. 6 days. A glorified cameo. Carl Spackler was meant to be background color, a weirdo groundskeeper who existed on the margins. But Murray showed up and refused to stay small. He improvised wildly, invented entire monologues, turned throwaway scenes into comedic gold. Ramos watched the dailies and realized what he had, so he kept Murray longer, added scenes, gave him more room to breathe. By the end, Murray had stolen the entire movie. His performance became the heartbeat, the unpredictable energy that made Caddyshack feel dangerous and alive. The studio didn't even know Murray was still on set until they saw the footage weeks later. 6 days turned into the film's soul, because sometimes the smallest roles become the biggest performances when you let brilliance run wild. Chevy Chase and Bill Murray, two legends, two Saturday Night Live icons, and in their entire careers, they only appeared together once. Here, in Caddyshack, the scene where they play midnight golf wasn't in the original script. It was added specifically to put both stars on screen at the same time. They shot it in one day, one night actually. The golf course was lit by floods. The two of them riffing, laughing, barely following any script. The crew knew they were witnessing something rare. Two comedic giants in their prime, orbiting each other for the first and only time. By then, their relationship off screen had already soured, making the casual chemistry on screen even more remarkable. The scene almost didn't make the cut. It didn't advance the plot, but Ramos kept it because he understood what it was, a moment of pure chemistry that would never happen again. Because sometimes history isn't planned. It's just two people being brilliant together for one night. The golf course explosion in the finale wasn't subtle. It was massive. Fire, debris, smoke billowing into the sky. The special effects team went all out, rigged charges across the green, timed detonations for maximum spectacle. When it went off, it was perfect. Huge, cinematic, dangerous. So dangerous that a nearby pilot radioed air traffic control thinking a plane had crashed. He saw the fireball, the smoke column rising, and assumed disaster. Emergency crews were nearly dispatched before someone clarified it was just a movie. Local news outlets ran the story, and for a brief moment, Caddyshack made headlines before it even finished filming. The effects team had over-delivered, almost catastrophically, but the shot worked. It became one of the film's most iconic moments, a giant middle finger to subtlety, to realism, to any sense of restraint, because Caddyshack didn't do anything halfway, not even explosions. The Caddyshack soundtrack soundtrack is weird. Kenny Loggins dominated it with I'm Alright, a song that became synonymous with the film, but buried in the credits, listed under music featured in the film, was John Williams' Jaws theme. Why? Because Carl Spackler hums it while stalking the gopher, a throwaway gag, a 2-second joke, but someone decided it warranted official credit. So the Jaws theme, one of the most iconic pieces of film music ever composed, sits on the Caddyshack soundtrack next to yacht rock and golf course jazz. From killer sharks to killer gophers. That's the range. The album became a surprise hit, climbing the Billboard charts and outselling films with far bigger musical budgets, because Caddyshack borrowed from everywhere and apologized to no one. Co-writer Brian Doyle Murray didn't make it up, he lived it. Before Hollywood, before comedy, he worked as a caddy at an Illinois country club. He carried bags for rich men who treated him like furniture. He watched class wars play out on fairways, saw snobbery disguised as etiquette, absorbed the tension between the haves and have-nots. All of that went into Caddyshack. The characters, the conflicts, the casual cruelty of the club members, it came from memory. Danny Noonan's desperation to fit in, the caddy's resentment, Judge Smale's entitlement, all real, all pulled from Doyle Murray's teenage summers carrying clubs for people who never learned his name. He even modeled specific characters after actual members he'd served, thinly disguised but unmistakable to anyone who knew the club. Autobiography disguised as slapstick. Because the best comedies aren't invented, they're remembered. Caddyshack cost about $6 million to make. Not huge, not tiny. Mid-range for 1980. The studio was nervous. First-time director, chaotic production, improvised script, but then it hit theaters and earned roughly $40 million domestically. A massive return, a surprise hit. For a movie about teenage caddies and exploding gophers, that's a hole-in-one. The studio executives who panicked during production suddenly took credit. The director who didn't know how to yell action became a hot commodity, and the gopher that almost got cut became a merchandising icon. Warner Brothers immediately greenlit a sequel, though it would take 8 years and never capture the magic. Money validated the chaos, because sometimes the messiest productions deliver the cleanest profits. The studio panicked. The early cut ran 4 hours. 4 hours of disconnected scenes, improvised riffs, half-finished ideas. Executives watched it and saw disaster. No story, no arc, no coherence. They demanded reshoots, rewrites, structural overhauls. They wanted Ramos to fix everything. Ramos refused. He said, "Trust the laughs." The studio didn't. They couldn't. 4 hours of comedy without a plot felt like career suicide, but Ramos held his ground. He cut it down, tightened it, added the gopher scenes, and trusted that audiences would forgive the lack of structure if the jokes landed hard enough. Test screenings became his weapon. Every time audiences roared, he gained leverage against nervous executives. He was right. Test audiences loved it. The laughs carried the film, the chaos became the point, and the studio learned a lesson they'd forget by the next production. Sometimes comedy doesn't need a map, it just needs momentum. Because Caddyshack proved you could build a hit on vibes, improvisation, and one director's stubborn faith in laughter. The entire cast stayed at the same Fort Lauderdale hotel. Cast, crew, everyone. And every night after shooting, the party started. Loud, wild, fueled by and adrenaline. The hotel became infamous, noise complaints piled up, security was called repeatedly, but production kept the location because it was convenient, and because the chaos off screen fed the chaos on screen. Bill Murray, Chevy Chase, Rodney Dangerfield, they'd gather in rooms, drink, tell stories, keep the energy going long after cameras stopped rolling. The lines between performance and reality blurred. The film absorbed the madness. Hotel staff later reported finding bizarre props, empty bottles, and one unexplained putting green installed in a suite. Life imitated art. Art imitated the parties, and no one slept much, because Caddyshack wasn't just a job. It was a month-long bender disguised as a production. Cindy Morgan played Lacey Underall, the seductive niece who dives into the pool in one of the film's most memorable scenes. But Morgan didn't do the dive. She couldn't. She needed contact lenses to see, and couldn't wear them underwater. Production couldn't risk her missing the mark, hitting the edge, or worse. So they hired a professional diver, a body double who looked close enough. The double performed the dive flawlessly. Morgan did everything else, the acting, the charm, the on-screen presence, but the plunge belonged to someone else. The double performed it in one take, a perfect arc that became one of the film's most paused moments on home video. Hollywood practicality meets Vanity Fair glamour, because sometimes the most iconic moments are the ones the stars never actually did. Doug Kenney was the creative force behind National Lampoon, Animal House, and Caddyshack, a comedy genius, a man who could see the absurd in everything and make it sing, but he was also fragile, depressed, depressed, self-destructive, and when Caddyshack premiered, he didn't celebrate. He disappeared. Weeks later, Kenny fell from a cliff in Hawaii. He was 33. Authorities ruled it an accident. Friends weren't sure. Some thought it was suicide. Others thought he just wandered too close to the edge, lost in his own head. Either way, he was gone. Ramos later said Kenny hated the final cut, felt it had been dumbed down, commercialized beyond his original vision. The laughter on screen hid a loss that still shadows the film's legacy. Because comedy came easy for Kenny, living didn't, and the man who made millions laugh couldn't save himself. Ted Knight hated the production. I hated the improvisation, the lack of structure, the chaos. He was a disciplined actor, trained in theater, used to scripts that made sense. Caddyshack made no sense. Scenes changed daily. Lines were invented on the spot. Knight felt lost, frustrated, powerless. But that frustration bled into his performance. Judge Smales' rage, his indignation, his barely controlled fury, it was real. Knight wasn't acting, he was venting, and it worked. His performance became one of the film's comedic anchors, sharp and bitter and perfectly timed. He reportedly told friends he'd never work on another comedy that is loose, that undisciplined, that insane. Caddyshack would be Knight's final major film role. He despised the experience but delivered comedy gold through pure frustration, because sometimes the best performances come from actors who hate every second. The final line of Caddyshack makes no sense. Rodney Dangerfield blurted it out at random during an improvised scene. Harold Ramis admitted later it didn't fit the story, didn't resolve anything, didn't mean much of anything, and that's exactly why it's perfect. Caddyshack ends the way it lived, unplanned, chaotic, nonsensical, and somehow unforgettable. The line landed, the audience laughed, and Ramis kept it because he understood the film didn't need closure. It just needed one last burst of energy. Writers tried to convince him to reshoot with something more coherent, but Ramis refused, because Caddyshack never pretended to make sense. It just swung hard and hoped for the best. The gopher wasn't just a puppet, it was a survivor. After filming Wrapped, John Dykstra kept the animatronic creature. It sat in his workshop for years, gathering dust, a relic of a chaotic production. Then, decades later, it was auctioned off. A private collector bought it for thousands of dollars. It now sits in someone's home, presumably still plotting revenge on groundskeepers. A Star Wars engineer's golf course rodent outlived the production, outlived some of the actors, and became a piece of cinematic history worth more than most people's cars. Because in Caddyshack, even the props refuse to fade quietly. 4 decades later, Caddyshack still swings wild. Harold Ramis learned to direct while directing. Doug Kenny wrote it and didn't live to see it become legend. Bill Murray improvised his way into immortality, and a Star Wars puppet saved the story. In a world of safe, polished comedies, it remains a beautiful disaster that refuses to apologize. Which of these behind-the-scenes facts surprised you most, and what movie should we dive into next?